When we think of dinosaurs, we generally imagine giant, scaly, terrifying monsters, and for good reason. But over the last 2 centuries, discoveries have revealed that not all dinosaurs were this way. In fact, some were downright feathery. And those feathers didn't just appear out of nowhere. The truth is they evolved from simpler structures found on their relatives. And understanding how these feathers evolved can tell us about how birds evolved, too. Hi, it's me, and welcome to my channel. This is our series on feathers where we talk about everything from what they are made of to why some birds have them and others do not. And today we are talking about the very first feathers because when it comes to the evolution of feathers, we are all just one big flap at a time. Feathers don't preserve well, so the earliest clear evidence of them only goes back about 150 million years. That's when people discovered fossils of the famous bird-like dinosaur Archaeopteryx, which had both teeth and feathers. This is a great example of an animal that's called a transitional fossil. It shows traits from animals that came before it, like teeth, a long bony tail and claws on its wings, and traits from animals that came after it, like feathers and a wishbone. So it helped scientists get a handle on the origin of feathers. But it still left more questions than answers, like when did feathers first evolve, what were they like, and why did dinosaurs start growing them? Let's start with the second question. Why would dinosaurs need feathers in the first place? We know that modern birds use them for all sorts of things. Obviously, they're used for flying, but they're also used for keeping warm, attracting mates, and hiding from predators. But even if feathers do end up serving many purposes, that doesn't necessarily explain why they evolved in the first place. And since we haven't found any fossilized feathers on older dinosaurs, scientists have had to make some educated guesses based on what we do know. One popular hypothesis is that feathers started out as simple filaments that helped early dinosaurs stay warm. There are lots of animals today that use feathers for insulation, like young alligators and some species of rat. That is, they use down feathers, which are short, soft feathers that lie flat against the body. This makes sense for dinosaurs, too, because most of them lived during a time period that scientists call the late Triassic, and the late Triassic was cold and dry. What's more, recent studies suggest that feathers might have been made of keratin, just like our hair and nails. And if that's true, they may have grown out of skin cells in a way similar to how mammals grow hair. Now, there are a few problems with this hypothesis. For one thing, archaeologists are pretty sure that feathers weren't like mammalian hair because they grew out of follicles close to the base of each feather instead of all along a midline like mammals. And we don't see anything like this in the fossil record, so perhaps they evolved multiple times independently. Another possibility is that feathers were originally used for display or attracting mates. After all, sexually selected traits often evolve before they become useful for something else, like flight. And if feathers started out as colorful, elaborate structures, it makes sense that they'd be selected for by natural processes later on. But there's no clear evidence for this idea either, so scientists have kept coming up with other ideas, and one of the most interesting ones suggests that feathers were originally used for gliding, not flying. Some researchers say that early feathers may have been like the flaps on a lizard's head, which are extensions of skin that help them regulate their temperature. If feathers were like that, they could have been useful for thermoregulation, but they could have also been useful for gliding. In 2023, a team of paleontologists proposed that feathers evolved from filaments on a dinosaur's arms and back that were used for display and then co-opted for gliding. Basically, this is the idea that feathers started out small and simple and got more complex over time. They may have started out as simple filaments that grew longer and thicker, eventually becoming flight feathers. Flight feathers are the long, curved feathers that are used for flying, like the ones you see on a hawk or an eagle. And they probably evolved from simpler feathers that were used for display or gliding. But why feathers? Why not scales or armor? Well, it turns out that feathers actually may have been the best option evolution had for early flying dinosaurs. You see, feathers are lighter than scales, which makes them good for gliding and flying. Plus, they're softer than scales, which means they wouldn't hurt the dinosaur if it fell onto them. And finally, they're stronger than skin, so they could withstand the stress of flapping. So it seems likely that feathers were the best solution for early flying dinosaurs. And that's why they became so widespread. But okay, we've talked about why feathers may have been useful, but how exactly do we know what the first feathers looked like? Well, it helps that we've found some really well-preserved fossils. For example, there's a fossil of a relative of Archaeopteryx named Anchiornis huxleyi, and this dinosaur had long feathers on its arms and legs, a tail fan, and downy feathers all over its body. So we know that feathers come in a huge variety of shapes, sizes, and arrangements. And thanks to fossils like Ankylosaurus, we can even get an idea of what colors they may have been. See, melanosomes are the cellular structures that produce melanin, the same stuff that gives your skin its color, and they preserve in feathers and hair and even dinosaur eggs. So scientists can estimate the color of an extinct animal by looking at the size and shape of its melanosomes. Studies have shown that Ankylosaurus had dark barring along its feathers, kind of like a zebra, and another study suggested that it had reddish-brown feathers. Another well-known feathered dinosaur is Sinosauropteryx. This dinosaur lived in China around 200 million years ago, and it was covered in long, pointed feathers. And by studying the shape of its feathers, scientists figured out that they were asymmetrical. That means one side of the feather was longer than the other, which helps with steering while flying. All this evidence paints a picture of dinosaurs that look much different than the scaly monsters we've imagined them to be. But these fossils also raise more questions than they answer. Like, what happened to the feathers after dinosaurs went extinct? Did birds inherit them, or did they evolve again independently in birds? Well, it turns out that birds didn't necessarily inherit feathers from dinosaurs, but they might have gotten them the same way we did. See, feathers are made out of keratin, which is also the main component of our hair and nails. And humans didn't evolve from dinosaurs. We split off from the lineage leading to birds much earlier than that. Yet we have hair and birds have feathers. And that means that feathers must have been present on the common ancestor of birds and mammals, which lived around 320 million years ago. And that means that feathers weren't unique to dinosaurs. They were a feature of many different kinds of vertebrates. Over time, feathers disappeared from most of them, but they stuck around in the lineage that led to birds. Today, birds have the most elaborate feathers, but they aren't the only ones. Some lizards and some species of fish have feathers too, and they're all related. These animals descended from a common ancestor that gave rise to all vertebrates with feathers, so in a roundabout way we can thank dinosaurs for giving us our luscious locks. And who knows, maybe they were even rocking a feathered fro. But none of this tells us how feathers work. How do they grow? How do they stay attached to animals? And how do they form their cool shapes? All of these are great questions, and luckily, next week we're going to talk about it. Join us for episode 4 of our Feathers series, where we dissect a feather to find out what makes them so strong. And if you want to learn more about feathers right now, check out our article on how they grow. We also have an article that explains how feathers are used in forensics, which you might be surprised to learn is a real thing. Thanks for watching.